Hi, I'm Juan, and as many of you know, just last week Sony introduced a brand new camera, the Sony a7R Mark IV. Totally unexpected. I was lucky enough to get a hands-on with the camera, and here are my first impressions. Well, I was lucky enough to be invited by Sony to go to New York and get a hands-on with the new camera that was introduced. And I have to tell you, I was pretty impressed. But, you know, I really didn't have that much time to play with it. I was at an event indoors with setups that we had to photograph in and whatnot. I didn't really get to use the camera in the environment that I'm used to shooting in. So that's why this is just a first impression. I was able to make some images with the camera. I was able to handle it, look at all the new stuff. So here are my first impressions of the camera. But first of all, I want to show you what the new specifications for the camera are. Let's take a look. What's new with the camera? Well, it's a 61 megapixel full frame mirrorless 35mm format camera. Something completely new in the industry. We have 10 frames per second with full autofocus tracking. We have a 68 frame buffer, and that's raw files, meaning that at 10 frames per second, you'll be able to shoot for almost 7 seconds, holding that shutter down all the way. We have 567 phase detection autofocus points. Real-time eye tracking, both human and animal. This is something absolutely new by Sony. The animal eye tracking. Pretty revolutionary. We also have an all-new 5.7 megapixel viewfinder, and that's up from a 3.7 megapixel on the A9 and the a7R Mark III. It is a huge improvement, I have to say. I didn't mind so much the previous one. I was okay with it, but you could sometimes tell there were certain situations where the pixels were just not fine enough. I think with this 5.7 megapixel, it's going to make a big improvement. The camera's been upgraded in the dust and weather sealing department, and I was able to witness that, and I have some pictures that I took of the camera itself, so you guys can actually see firsthand what these improvements are like. Something that's been requested by a lot of us, dual UHS 2 slots. What else is new? We have wireless tethering. For those of you that do tethering, shoot tethering a lot, being able to do wireless tethering is huge. It's a huge improvement. Yes, this sensor is a 61 megapixel sensor, but through a technology called pixel shift that Sony has developed, you can actually shoot files that are 240 megapixels in size. Yes, these are still images in still lives. Nothing can be moving in the scene, but that's still pretty remarkable, 240 megapixels. Oh, something that is absolutely awesome. You can now save your settings that you've set up, that you've painstakingly spent your time going through every single menu and customize it for your needs, including the buttons. And now you can save all those settings onto a file so that then you can reload it back in. This is really important because sometimes when we send our cameras in for service or for cleaning, when they update the firmware there, which they always do, it completely wipes your settings. Plus, this also means that we can actually be sharing settings, potentially. I haven't tried this feature yet, but it's something that I'm definitely going to be trying. Something that's been talked about quite a bit, enhanced ergonomics. And again, I took a bunch of pictures of the cameras, and I'm going to show you some of that. Now, something that is pretty exciting for a lot of us, people like me who are shooting videos, or anybody who's doing videography with this camera, there's a new digital microphone interface and a new microphone to go along with that. And I'm going to show you a little preview of that in a little bit as well. So what has stayed the same? 15 stop of dynamic range. you know, it's about the same as the a7R Mark III. Maybe, you know, from all the reports that are out there, this has a little bit of improvement over that, maybe by 0.3 of stops. But, you know, we'll have to see really when we get the camera in some challenging situations where we can really push that dynamic range on the camera. And it has a 5-axis in-body image stabilization. Now, supposedly it has been enhanced and improved to support the 61 megapixel, because 61 megapixels, that's a lot of pixels. And what that means is that your image stabilization needs to be that much better and that much more fine-tuned for those extra megapixels. So supposedly Sony has been able to do that as well. Not something I've been able to confirm yet either. The camera feels better, but it has the same number of buttons and controls, and they're all in the same location. Nothing has moved significantly, so the camera still feels really familiar in hand. If you're used to any of the A7 bodies, all the buttons are in the same places and you have the same number of buttons. And very important, we have the same batteries as the A7 series, the a7R III and the A9 and so forth, the larger battery, the FZ batteries. Now, question that I get all the time, well, I don't need 61 megapixels. You hear this all the time. Why do you need 61 megapixels? I'm not printing billboards. Well, guess what? 61 megapixels is very, very useful to just about everybody. Yes, there is a trade-off that you have to make, in that this means larger files that you have to deal with. It also means longer processing time with Lightroom. Your camera is going to be working, or your computer, I'm sorry, is going to be working harder at processing those files. But I think the trade-offs are definitely well worth it. The most important thing, why 61 megapixels is such a huge thing, is because it gives you more room to crop an image, meaning that you can not have to zoom in as much to allow room for movement, let's say. So that if, let's say you're photographing gymnasts and they're jumping, if you want to be able to get them right in the frame, being able to have more room to crop is actually a big thing. You have almost 50% more pixels. So when you do crop, you end up with a larger file. And that really translates into having more reach as well, which means that you may not have to carry out in the field a longer lens. For us, nature and wildlife photographers, we're oftentimes taking on the field large, long lenses. This means that we can get away with shorter lenses because we can crop more into the image and effectively have a longer reach with our camera. Just as an example, let's say that I'm using the new 200 to 600 millimeter lens that Sony released recently. With this camera in a special mode called the APS-C mode, basically like a built-in crop factor in the camera, you can turn that mode on. That turns that lens at the 600 end of the range into a 900 millimeter lens. So think about this. Shooting 900 millimeters at f6.3 is pretty remarkable in a nice small hand-holdable lens. That is pretty cool. You know, there is this, like I said, this APS-C mode that you turn on in the camera that's going to basically do an automatic crop in the camera and give you that extra reach. It's like basically using a crop sensor camera. Honestly, I'm never going to turn it on. I'm going to shoot at 61 megapixels and then crop in as much as I need to. That way I'm not limited to the APS-C form factor. Oh, that APS-C mode gives you 26.2 megapixels. So think about that. You're able to crop that frame quite a bit, going from 600 to 900 millimeters, and you still end up with a 26.2 megapixel file. That is actually pretty remarkable. Just wanted to give you a couple of examples here of what some of the images I was able to make with this camera, and what this zoom factor allows you to do, and the resolution that you're getting. So here is this image that I'm showing you now was shot with a Sony 24 to 70 millimeter lens, and this is a full frame shot. Now, Adobe Lightroom does not support raw processing for this camera yet. So all the images that I'm going to be showing you are going to be JPEG images, because I have no way to process these in an accurate way. Yeah, there are some people that have been able to get a processor to convert some of the raw files into DNG files and then edit those, but I don't trust it. I don't know where that is coming from. I don't know the quality that it's producing, so I'd rather just show you the JPEGs as they come out of the camera. Now remember, these are JPEGs. So this is a full frame shot, and I'm going to show you when I crop in this image, the amount of data I still retain. I'm going to crop in, do a really, really severe crop into the face of this model. And look at that. I did an extreme crop there, and I can still see an enormous amount of detail. Again, this is a JPEG. I imagine I'm going to be able to see a lot more detail with a raw file when I crop in this much. I can see individual eyelashes, I can see skin texture, I can see individual hairs on top of the head. Pretty remarkable. This is what 61 megapixel gets you. Yes, yeah, like I said, it's going to take a little bit more processing, a little bit more power, but I think in the end, the results are definitely well worth it. What about the autofocus system? That's something that's been talked about, and Sony has been doing an incredibly good job with the autofocus system in the latest cameras like the a7R Mark III, as well as the incredible A9. Well, I'll tell you, the Mark IV, the a7R Mark IV, it is no slouch. It has more phase detect focus points than the a7R Mark III. So if you look at the a7R Mark IV, that has 567 using fast hybrid focus points. The a7R III had 399. That's a significant difference, a significant increase in focus points. But it still doesn't reach the number of focus points of the A9, which has 693. And those focus points are something different. They're called wide area focus points. I'm not exactly sure what the difference is between fast hybrid and wide area, but I know in my hands-on with the camera that the camera does focus faster and more accurately and better in low light than the a7R Mark III. So that is a huge improvement. For a lot of us, for most people really, the A9 is kind of overkill. You know, as a matter of fact, I haven't been using my A9 all that much because I've been shooting mostly with my a7R Mark III because I prefer the dynamic range, first of all, of the a7R Mark III than over the A9, as well as the larger files. Yes, the A9 gives me two things that the 7 series doesn't give me. The 20 frames per second, as well as the incredible autofocus. Third thing, as well as the the blackout free viewfinder. I'll talk about that in a little bit. All three cameras have the same number of contrast detection points, autofocus detection points. That's 425 of them. So I don't see that necessarily adding or taking away anything from either of those. And like I said, the low light autofocus seems to be as good, if not better. I think it's actually better than the a7R Mark III. But really, only time out in the field in real world situations is going to tell us how well this camera performs. I am dying to get my hands on this camera and use it out in the field, because that's really how I am going to determine the camera. I'm not going to determine how well the autofocus works by following my dog around the house or shooting someone's cat or anything like that. It's really how it performs out in the field, because that's when it's most important, right? Is when you're out in the field photographing and how that camera behaves, not how it behaves, you know, running around your house following your dog or your cat or anything like that. Now, what about something that we've heard of a lot, and Sony's been talking about this quite a bit, the real-time eye tracking. Well, in my experience, I've been using it for quite a bit with the a7R Mark III, and I used it with this camera, and it kind of works. It still needs a little bit of work, but it works, you know, pretty well. Seems more reliable at this point with people than with animals, even though the animal eye tracking is there, and it does pick up eyes. For example, I've had to pick up the eyes of some birds. I've had to pick up eyes of bison. But you know, sometimes it misses and it catches another part of the animal thinking that's the eye. So it's really, you know, not 100% there. You know, the good news is that I've never yet have it get in the way, meaning I've never had it focus on something in another part of the animal and misfocus, for example. Yeah, I've had it, for example, pick up the nose of an animal, but that was okay. You know, my animal, I still had enough of the field where the eye was still in focus, so that worked out. So far, I have mine on. I let it, you know, do its thing, because sometimes it does pick up the eye, and when it does pick up the eye, it actually does a pretty good job. But again, as with autofocus, only real time in the field will tell us how effective it is. And my feeling is that it's going to work great in certain situations, but not so great in others, depending on, especially on the animals that you're shooting. For people, it seems to do actually pretty well, and tracking people that move quite a bit, it actually does remarkably well. I've seen that firsthand. With animals, we're kind of, you know, maybe 50-50, but I expect that to get better and better over time. Sony has not been resting on their laurels like some of the other camera manufacturers, and they've been improving their system continuously. And I expect this, because it's one of the big differentiators for Sony compared to the other camera manufacturers. I expect this to be to improve over time and get better and better to the point where it's going to work very effectively. When animal eye tracking does get, you know, really good, this could be a game changer for all of us that are wildlife photographers. So something definitely to keep your eye on, so to speak. What about frame rate? The a7R III is 10 frames a second, same as the a7R Mark IV is 10 frames a second, same as the a7R III, while the A9 can shoot up to 20 frames a second. But I will tell you, in reality, 20 frames a second is too much in most cases. You end up filling those cards so incredibly fast that I almost never shoot at 20 frames a second. The only time when I'm shooting at 20 frames a second may be when I am photographing a bird in flight, like an eagle or a small passerine bird that I'm trying to catch in flight. And then those 20 frames a second does become you know, useful for getting that critical moment, critical image. Or critical point of action. But most of the time, you know, 20 frames a second is too much. 10 frames a second for most people is more than decent. You know, for wildlife is decent. For most other situations, 10 frames a second is quite good. For us wildlife photographers, you know, 10 frames a second is adequate. I would have rather have seen maybe 14, 15, somewhere around there, which is what I shoot the A9 most of the time. That would have been much better. But I understand we're talking about 61 megapixels for every one of those images. Lots and lots of data that needs to be captured off that sensor and flushed into a buffer, and then from the buffer going into the cards themselves. So I'm talking about that a little bit. If you want to take advantage of that full speed, frames per second, you want to make sure you're using the fastest cards that you can use, which are the UHS-2 cards. That's why this camera has 2 UHS-2 slots. Right now, the cards that I recommend are the ones from Sony, the ones that can read and write at 300 megabits per second. Those are going to give you the fastest performance. Those are the fastest cards that exist out there today. Yeah, there are cards from other manufacturers that are UHS-2, and they claim, you know, close to 300. It's like 250, 290, but usually that's in read, not in writes, and you want those writes to be super fast. The reads being fast are convenient because it allows you to download the images a lot quicker when you take the card into a card reader, and a UHS-2 card reader, by the way, and plug it into your computer. But you want cards that can write super fast so that you can take full advantage of the frame rate of these cameras. Now, what about the dynamic range? You know, Sony has been touting, is making a big deal that this camera has 15 stop dynamic range. You know, but they kind of said the same thing about the a7R Mark III. Well, DxO tested the 7R Mark III, And I think they rated it, if I remember correctly, at 14.7 the stops of dynamic range, which is pretty remarkable. So having that, if in fact Sony has upped the ante here to 15 frames or 15 stops of dynamic range, that's going to make a big difference. Yes, it doesn't sound like much, like it's a third of a stop, but a third of a stop can actually make a big difference when you're shooting in those high contrast situations. So yeah, I mean, Sony made the same claim that the a7R Mark III had 15 stops. They're making the same claim now. There may be a little bit of truth to the fact that this has a little better dynamic range. We'll have to see. My hope is that it's on par with the a7R Mark III and not with the A9. My experience of the A9, the dynamic range is nowhere near what the a7R Mark III is. So I'm really hoping that with the Mark IV, we see, you know, as the reports have been coming out, that increased dynamic range even over the Mark III, which will be a remarkable feat when you think about how much smaller those photo cell sizes are on the camera. Just wanted here to show you again, this is another image that I photographed at the event in New York. JPEG again. And this was a really high contrast situation. This was inside a building. It was at night, completely lit by artificial lights. And you had a very extreme dark subject here with our model with a dark shirt and dark jacket. And then you had these lights up the top that were lit up and bright. And then you had a white rug, shag rug down at the bottom, as well as a white tub. And I do have to say that I am impressed at the level of detail that the camera was able to capture, even on this JPEG. Yes, you know, we lose some detail in the darks, and we lose a little bit of detail in the highlights up here and the light especially, but it still held pretty well. This was a pretty extreme example of high contrast in this scene. Here's a more typical image. Again, we were shooting, even though it kind of looks like daylight on the outside. These are artificial lights because it was nighttime. And you do have some high contrast here, but not as much as in the previous one because it was a more open area that we were shooting in. But you can see how the colors and the textures and the light is very exquisitely captured here. We do have a little bit of hot spots, which is expected down in the lights back here and the wood paneling and then the light that's on down to the left of the image. But other than that, beautiful, beautiful rendering of the dynamic range in this image. Pretty impressive. And what I've done is, you can see here, I put up the settings for each of these images so that you have an idea of what the settings were when I made those images, as well as the actual dimensions of the file itself. Now, what about the blackout free viewfinder? And this was one of the, or is one of the great, amazing things about the A9. And one of the advantages of mirrorless cameras over the DSLRs, in that because there's no mirror moving up and down to obscure your view, you are probably, or you have the ability to be able to capture or be able to see the images as they're being made without being interrupted by the viewfinder getting obstructed. You know, this is my biggest disappointment with the Mark IV. I was hoping that with this camera, we would inherit the capabilities of the A9 to have a completely blackout free viewfinder. With the A9, your screen never goes dark. Your viewfinder never goes dark. You actually see the image the entire time. It doesn't blink, it doesn't slow down, it's all real time, absolutely gorgeous and beautiful. With the a7R III, you can turn on a kind of continuous mode in which the image does slow down a little bit. The image quality of the viewfinder decreases or diminishes. It actually kind of gets to, becomes kind of like a black and white image. But you can still follow your subject, and with a decreased amount of blackout in the scene. So it's actually it's very useful, and that's the way I shoot most of the time for action photography, is with that mode. The Mark IV has something similar in that it's similar to the way that the Mark III works, not like the A9, but like the Mark III. But the advantage is that the image does not, how shall I say, does not, the quality of the image doesn't degrade. And I mean, when the quality of the image degrading on the Mark III, it doesn't degrade in the raw file, on the capture file. It's only when you're looking through the viewfinder. The image in viewfinder gets degraded. With the a7R IV, what happens is that there's a little bit of lag in the viewfinder. The image kind of slows down, and that's actually like almost like a stroboscopic effect. But it's in color. It doesn't degrade as much as it did with the Mark III. So it's an improvement over the Mark III, but it's not quite what I was hoping, or what a lot of us, I'm sure, were hoping to be just like the A9. A little bit of a disappointment, which is too bad. However, it was still good enough that I was very easily able to capture scenes like this one. At that event, they had some modern dancers that were doing acrobatics and jumps and whatnot. And it was a cinch. Super easy to capture the peak of action in any one of these situations with that viewfinder. Much better than it was with a DSLR, I can guarantee you that. So although it's not as good as the A9, it's still, you know, leaps and bounds better than a DSLR. It actually works very, very nicely. A few other miscellaneous improvements on the camera. Like I said before, there are dual UHS slots, which is very useful. Allows you to set the camera up so that when one card is full, it starts writing to the second card automatically, or flows to the second card. Or you could write to both cards at the same time. You could write, you know, 2 copies of the same file to the card as a backup. You could do that before, but because the a7R III and the A9, for that matter, only have one UHS slot, the second slot is a slower slot, your camera is going to perform, you know, at the speed of the slowest slot. So if you're writing to those two simultaneously. I personally never do that. I always have it in relay shooting so that it went from the fast card to the slow card. You know, and I use the slow card kind of as an insurance policy. So yes, this dual UHS 2 slot is a huge improvement. But again, remember, you need those UHS 2 cards in order to take full advantage of that. Wireless tethering. I know a lot of folks are going to be very happy about this. Being able to tether to a desktop program, it could be even Lightroom, and you'll be able to do this wirelessly now, which is a huge improvement. No cords to trip over. You'll be able to move more freely in your studio if you need to, so that someone can be reviewing your images while you're shooting them, your client or assistants or anything like that. Big feature for a lot of folks. As I mentioned earlier, the pixel shift technology, which is included in the a7R Mark III, has now taken a big leap forward with the a7R Mark IV. If I remember correctly, you can now take up to 16 images, which will then get processed together and produce a file with a astonishing 240 megapixels. Very, very impressive. I've seen samples of this, and it's mind-blowing. It's actually really, really cool. Now, the disadvantage of this is that you're shooting still scenes, architecture, maybe landscapes when there's not a lot of wind going on, still lives, things of that nature. Unfortunately, no moving subjects, because this takes a little while to accumulate all those different shots. As I mentioned earlier, the save and load camera settings, huge. This is awesome. You know, and hopefully what this will allow us to do is to be able to share camera settings. I think that will be pretty remarkable. Another thing that a lot of us are really welcoming is the improved dust and weather sealing. I know the a7R Mark III and previous cameras got quite a bit of flack for their not so great camera weather sealing, but I can tell you by looking at this camera and seeing, and I'll show you pictures of this, there is a big difference and a vast improvement on all the little seals and the doors and whatnot on the camera. So I'm really optimistic about this. Here is a picture so that you can actually see the improvements in weather sealing. This is on the left side of the camera where all the ports are. And this is what the little doors look like now. You can see how beefy they are. They kind of rubberize and they feed into tiny little wells. You can see the rubber area right here on these little doors that sort of fit into this groove and seals that nice and tight in there. Big improvement. The door to the card slots has also been improved, and it looks like it does a much better job at sealing against the elements. You can also see here that the slots have now changed, which is something that threw me off. Slot 1 is now at the top. It used to be that slot 1 and in the A9 and the a7R Mark III, the slot 1 is at the bottom. With the a7R Mark IV, slot 1 is now at the top, something to keep in mind. But much more rugged camera door, and much better sealing. You can see it has like a little double door. This part of the slot door seals against this little rubber seal here, protecting it from water entering and breaching the camera. Vast improvement. Same thing with the door at the bottom. That was something that Sony got a lot of criticism about, that the previous camera doors were actually kind of flimsy and did let quite a bit of water in. This one seems a lot better designed. It'll close a lot nicer, which will be a nice improvement over the previous door design. Now, another thing that's huge about this camera, and I think it's going to be a big game changer, is that better ergonomics in the camera. Now I'm going to show you some pictures of that, but the camera now has a deeper grip, fatter, easier to hold deeper grip. We have a more contoured grip as well, not grip as well. I'm going to show you a picture of that as well. Angle and better feeling shutter button. That button feels a lot better, has a much better feel when you press it, and it's also angled, so it's actually a lot easier to depress. Bigger autofocus button. This is huge. Much better joystick as well. Much better. All the buttons across the board feel better. They're larger, easier to feel even with gloves on. The one part that I don't think has been improved all that much is the wheel on the back. But the wheel on the top has been improved quite a bit. So it makes a big difference, that new wheel on the top. And something that a lot of people have been asking about is a lockable exposure compensation dial. Because I know this is something that a lot of folks get into trouble with, that as they carry the camera walking around, the camera rubs against their body and the exposure compensation gets shifted, and then they take a shot and the exposure compensation is all over the place. You know, I'll be honest with you, I'm not exactly sure how that happens, because this is a mirrorless camera. When you look through that viewfinder, you should be able to tell that your exposure compensation was out of whack. But in any case, now there's a button on it that allows you to lock it. Something I know a lot of people are going to love. So here is a picture, a sideways picture of the new grip. You can see it's a lot thicker, a lot deeper, as well as much more contoured. You can see how the area here where your middle finger resides is a lot deeper, giving you a much more positive grip on the camera as well. You can also see, and I'll have a better picture of this, you can see the angled shutter button up here. You can see how my hand, I have smaller hands, and this grip feels beautiful, feels really nicely. It actually feels better than the a7R III or the A9 grip. I felt that those grips were a little small even for my smaller hands. I do love the feel of this grip. You can see now how that new battery door closes a little better, seals a little nicer at the bottom. Here's a close-up shot of the new joystick and the buttons. You can see the AF on button is a little bigger than the previous ones and a little bit more prominent. The automatic exposure lock and the FM buttons are a little bigger, but the big star here is this joystick button is a lot bigger. You can also see in this picture the new top dial. It's been moved. Before it was kind of embedded into the body, now it's raised. It's actually kind of on par with the exposure compensation dial. I know that's going to irk a lot of people because they're going to get confused between the two dials, but I think it's a big improvement as well. Here is a bigger picture of the entire camera, the whole back, and you can see how much bigger in relation to the other buttons are this new joystick is. You can also see how the menu C3 and the AF1 button are kind of raised. They have a better feel to them as well. So from an ergonomics perspective, this is a biggie. Here's another close-up of that top dial. Much easier to use, much more prominent, easier to find, especially with gloves. Here's a view from the top of the camera as well. Looks really familiar, really similar really to the a7R Mark III. Here is the improved shutter button, which is angled as well as a much better feel to it. You can see here the angle of that, and you can also see here clearly the two C1 and C2 buttons and how they're raised even higher, a little bit bigger, and they have this raised ridge to them, which makes it a lot easier to feel when you're shooting with it. Here you can really clearly see the angle of the new shutter button. It makes a big difference. It feels a lot better, a lot more positive as you're trying to press that shutter button. And here's the new logo, the a7R Mark IV, along with a close-up of the C3 and menu buttons. And you can see how they've also been improved. For video folks, there's a couple of new changes and additions here. There's an improved video autofocus. I know a lot of folks are really excited about that because now eye tracking is available when shooting videos, which is a huge thing for folks. There's also touch tracking on the back of the camera. You can use a touch screen to actually track or allow the camera, tell the camera which subject to track. And for me, actually, this is the part that I'm most excited about, is the new digital microphone interface and a new digital microphone. What this allows you to do is connect the microphone to the top. There's a couple coming out from Sony, including the one that I like the best, the ECM B1M, which is an electronic shotgun type microphone. Will have a direct digital connection between the microphone and the camera, improving sound quality tremendously. And this is what the new microphone looks like. Yes, that is the entire microphone. It does come with a windscreen, but you can see on the controls on the back, you have 3 different pickup patterns that you can choose from. You can change it from digital to analog. You can change the audio levels. You know, really nicely done little microphone. It's nice and small too, so it doesn't take up a huge amount of space. Unknowns. Well, I've talked about a lot of these already, but let me go over them again. Dynamic range performance. This is one that we're just gonna have to play with and see what it's going to look like. Until we get the camera on the field and we actually can use it, we don't really know what it's gonna be like. But my hopes are pretty high at this point. And the reason for that is because we don't have any RAWs as of yet. I shouldn't say that. I have RAW files. I just don't have anything to process those RAW files with yet because there's no support from Lightroom yet, from Adobe on Adobe Camera Raw, and Sony hasn't released the new processor, the Capture One processor for the RAW files yet. Also, autofocus performance. So far it looks great, but there's some things that for me as a wildlife photographer and for some of you guys, we really need to test. And for example, is autofocus tracking at f8. And why is this important? So for example, if you're shooting with 100 to 400 G master lens from Sony, the a7R III and the A9 can focus with that beautifully. However, if I were to put a teleconverter on that 100-400, which I do, you know, quite often because the performance of that combination is absolutely stunning. Now when you're shooting at 400 millimeters, you're now down to f8, and the A9 can focus and keep do track autofocus with that, no problem, autofocus tracking. However, the a7R III cannot autofocus track at f8. So when you put that teleconverter on the 100-400, and you want to follow a moving animal, you want to do autofocus tracking, you can't do that with the a7R Mark III. My hope is that the a7R Mark IV allows us to do autofocus tracking at f8. But until I'm able to take it out in the field, I get the camera in hand, I'm able to use it in real world situations, I'm withholding judgment on this, whether the autofocus is really that much more improved over the a7R Mark III. And for me, this is crucial. As a wildlife photographer, someone that's looking to shoot at long focal lengths, this is critical. And then the noise performance and the high ISO performance. What does the noise characteristics look like with this camera? What does it look like at ISO 800, ISO 1600, ISO 3200? How will it compare with the a7R Mark III? The a7R Mark III is actually a remarkable camera on its performance. So I have high hopes that this camera will do really well. The increase in resolution will tell us that that won't necessarily, that they won't hold as well, or won't hold its weight against the a7R Mark III. But Sony has been the leader, and they've been doing an incredible job with their sensors. So I'm hoping that they pull that rabbit out of the hat, and we will see the same noise performance and high ISO performance on the same or better than the Mark III. And then the eye tracking. I think eye tracking, especially animal eye tracking, is still evolving, and it's going to take time. But I'm really excited about this because it's going to be a game changer over time. Disappointments with the camera. Well, my biggest disappointment is that we don't have a blackout free viewfinder. I was really hoping to have that because I absolutely love that feature on the A9. It's probably my favorite feature of the A9. So I was really disappointed it wasn't on the Mark IV, but we can't have everything. If it had that, this camera would have been incredible. And disappointments. I guess another disappointment is the price on the cameras, $3,500. It is a disappointment and it isn't. It's a pricey camera, it's $3,500. But honestly, for what we're getting with this camera, the resolution, the features and whatnot, it's a bargain, and the same vein as well. You're not going to be able to find anything like this for this price range anywhere else. We're talking about medium format type resolutions in this camera. It's not the medium format look for sure, so I don't really like to call this an equivalent to a medium format camera. They're very different beasts. But we're talking about medium format type resolution in a $3,500 package. And when we're looking at medium format cameras, we're talking cameras that cost $8, $10, $20, $20, $30, $40,000. So $3,500 in that context seems like a bargain. But it's still pricey. $3,500 is quite a bit of money for a camera, especially at the pace that Sony keeps putting out these cameras. That seems like a lot of money in one way, but it seems like a bargain in another. So, okay, the final verdict. I'm very excited about this camera. I think I don't want to call it a game changer because it's not a game changer. I see this as a less revolutionary camera. Some people have been calling it that. I'm not so sure it's a revolutionary camera, but it's definitely a big step in the evolution of the a7R series of cameras. Big step. We have 61 megapixel in a 35mm full frame format. This is the first. This is incredible. And if the noise characteristics and high ISO performance are as good as it looks, this is going to be a big winner. I think these cameras are going to fly off the shelves, and it's going to be, kind of a big change in some of the way that people work. I know it's going to change the way I work with 61 megapixels versus even 42 megapixels that I'm shooting now with the a7R Mark III. I really wish I had more time to spend with this camera in a familiar environment, not in indoors at night in New York with a bunch of other people in set up stages to photograph. I wish I was able to take this camera out in the field where I'm more comfortable shooting in, tracking maybe some moose in northern Maine, or some bison and wolves and bears in Yellowstone. You know, soon enough I'll be able to do that. The camera's released in September. I am heading out to out west in September, so I'll have the camera with me then. I'm really excited for that, but I wish I had time to do that before. I pre-ordered the camera. I don't get a discount from Sony. I buy these cameras just like you. I pre-ordered it. That was, you know, very early on when I placed my order, so I hope to be one of the first ones to get it, and I will do a full review then. But just a word of caution, if you will, or a word of advice. I'm never going to be the first one out of the gate to provide an in-depth review, because people who rush out to do those in-depth review, they really don't have the time to spend with a camera, especially in real world scenarios. They may go around, you know, their city or in town and shoot, you know, their cats. People who do portraiture may be able to go and do that a lot easier. For me, that I'm out in the field, I'm shooting landscapes, I'm shooting wildlife, I need to go out to my usual stomping grounds, and that takes planning, honestly. So I am not going to be the first one out there out of the gate to give you a comprehensive review of the camera when it comes out. But I will promise you that I will come out with a comprehensive review once I've had time to actually put the camera through its paces, and I've been able to work with it and really understand the ins and outs, so I can give you an honest review of the camera while it's being used out in the field. Well, folks, I hope you've enjoyed this first impressions of the new, really exciting, newly released Sony a7R Mark IV. Like I said, when I'm able to get my hands on the camera and put it through its paces, I'll have a much more comprehensive review for you guys. Until then, make sure to subscribe to my channel if you like what you see, and if you think I've earned it, click on the little bell so that you'll be notified whenever I release any new videos. I'll be releasing videos on all sorts of topics, but if you have topics you'd like me to cover or questions you have for me, make sure to send them to me through Facebook or my website, or send me an email at juan@pons.org. Until next time, take care, folks, and hope to see you out in the field.